remind you from what I said about the difference between progestogens in goats and sheep. Goats rely on the corpus luteum through the whole of gestation, whereas ewes only rely on it up to about day 60, and then the placenta takes over. So if you give prostaglandins after day 60, you're probably not going to have any effect on a pregnant ewe. Towards the end of pregnancy, you may bring birth forward by a few hours, but during the lump of mid-pregnancy, you're not going to have an effect with prostaglandins. So they're quite safe to use in mid-pregnancy in ewes. However, you can abort them prior to that. If you use it 28 to 56 days, you can abort them. 14 to 28 days, you have to use high doses to abort them, but you can do. It is important to say that prostaglandins are not licensed in sheep. The embryo produces an embryo or ovine trophoblastic protein about day 13, and that is what's responsible for making the ewe aware that she is pregnant. So the prostaglandins are not produced, so the corpus luteum is not lysed, and pregnancy continues. Targets. You have to be very careful with targets in sheep. It isn't quite the same as cows. The reason is that there is such variability in sheep breeds, and there is such a variability in farming systems that sheep are kept under. The altitude, whether you're north, south, east, west in the UK, makes a tremendous difference to what the sheep are expected to do. We have a list of commonly used figures. We have a marking rate, which is the number of ewes that a top will top within a cycle. We've got a return rate, which is the number that he will have to top in the next cycle, so that he has topped the first time but have not held, so represent 17 days later. We've got a lambing rate, and we've got weaning or reared rate. I would argue that the only one you're actually interested in is the weaning or percentage reared, because everything else is largely irrelevant. It is irrelevant how many lambs you get in the ground if you cannot keep those lambs alive until you're selling them. So the important figure is what number of lambs per 100 ewes you get off farm. The only use of all the other targets are to help you to understand where that system has broken down, if it is not performing adequately. So you're gathering all this data to be able to understand where the system has become broken, if indeed it has become broken. Because the return rate or the lambing rate, that does not make you rich or poor. It is the number of lambs that you sell off the farm that makes you rich or poor. eBlex is a stunningly useful organisation. It gives loads of beautifully simple information, nicely presented, and it comes up with loads of targets. They are practical targets, they're useful targets. You should have a ballpark idea of what these targets are, so that if somebody is having a conversation, you roughly know whether they're ballpark right or ballpark wrong. What I find frightening about these targets are, if you look at the percentage of lambs scanned, you're talking about lowland flock, you're talking about near 200%, so most, on average, your ewes are having 2 lambs inside them at scanning, whereas you actually only raise about 1.7. So you're losing something like 1/7 of those lambs between scanning and selling. It's a huge biological waste. You could argue that it's a huge welfare issue. But we do this, and we've been doing this for the last as long as I remember, and it hasn't largely changed. If you actually look at the national flock, we raise about 130% of our ewes in lambs every year across the country. And that hasn't changed in about the last 20 years, despite entirely different breeds being out there, despite being more information out there, despite being better ways of feeding sheep. Those figures haven't changed. And what you quite often find is, if you move to a more prolific sheep, you get more lambs scanned, you get more lambs born, and you get more lambs die. And actually you end up with roughly the same number of lambs reared. So it is not necessarily a useful thing to move to a more prolific sheep, such as introducing your Barula gene or your Inverdale gene, that is not necessarily a profitable way forward. It can be a very depressing way forward, because you can have all these lambs that are born and within a week you're putting them in a plastic bag and getting them taken off farm, which is a stunningly depressing thing to do. So the skill is to get those lambs alive on the ground and get those lambs sold off as being fat. And just the bottom half of the table then should be starting to be able for you to drill in why your rearing percentage is not matching up to your scanning percentage, and where you can intervene to try and improve that. So reproductive failure, we can break it down into groups, as we always do as humans. We love breaking things into groups, we love categorizing things, but as with everything else, there's blurring between those lines. So our first failure will be low ovulation rate. Now, two overarching things behind that. One is we've got the wrong genetics, so we're trying to have all our soys to have twins. That's not going to really work. We need something slightly more prolific than a soy. If we want twins, if we want singles, that's absolutely fine. Again, nutrition is the other major thing. So if we've got a blackie, if we feed it well, we're quite likely to have twins in a reasonable number of them. If we half-starve it, we're going to have singles in every single one. So our two big things about ovulation rate are genetics and nutrition. Added into that, if all our sheep are young, as in a year old, we're much more likely to have singles. If they're all 3-4 years old, we're much more likely to have twins, because those sheep are well into their reproductive cycles. They're not trying to do two things simultaneously. They're not trying to grow and reproduce at the same time. If we're on the rump end of the season, so we're in that first cycle or we're in the last cycle of the year, we're much more likely to have singles rather than twins. It is suggested that weather will reduce the ovulation rate. It doesn't tend to reduce the ovulation rate, it tends to cause early embryonic death rather than lowered ovulation rate, unless the nutrition is affected by that weather. We had very kind weather to sheep this autumn in some ways, so they had loads of nutrition, so the ovulation rate was much higher. So low ovulation rate is normally associated with a U factor. Low conception rates are more typically associated with rams. So we've got infertile rams or subfertile rams. There's rarely such a thing as an infertile ram, they're usually subfertile. But we can have an apparent lower conception rate because of early embryonic death, which is associated with stress, weather. Again, genetics will give us a lower conception rate and a age of ewe, because if you've got ewe lambs growing, they are more susceptible to stress because they're trying to do two things at once. So if you have a ewe lamb, it may well ovulate, it may well fertilize that egg, but then whenever it comes to actually implanting it, it is more fragile, so something stresses it, it loses that. Again, lower conception rates if we've got disease going around then. We also have abortion rate, which we'll come to in the last talk this morning. And the last reason for reproductive failure is high perinatal losses. So that goes back to your lamb losses. It goes back to your nutrition around the time or in the last third of pregnancy. So ewe fertility, we expect 75 to 85% of ewes to be pregnant in their first service. We will find that ewe lambs and gimmers that are presented to the top in the second season for the first time to be less fertile. Our gimmers that have been presented as ewe lambs to the top will probably be equally fertile, as in whole to the top, in the second season as an adult ewe. So we've got a pre-programming going on there, where there is a benefit to exposing our ewe lambs to a male in the first year as to how they will perform in their second year. Even if they've never become pregnant, exposing to the top probably makes that they will be better at ovulating and demonstrating estrus in the second year. It is commonly stated that ewe lambs and gimmers that have never been exposed to a top are less sexually experienced, so therefore they will not present themselves to the top. I personally have never observed that. The top and the ewe lambs seem to find each other beautifully, and it seems to be never a problem. I do think it is a bigger issue that if they haven't been pre-programmed for it, their system isn't pre-programmed. It isn't showing oesterases strongly for as long if they have not had oesterases and not been exposed to the male before. It has to be remembered whenever you cull out all your barreners after scanning or lambing that not all those barreners are genuinely barren. They are obviously not carrying lambs, but they may well have been fertile at the point of topping. Because if you do your calculations, if you've got 75% of them hold to the first service and the same percentage hold to the second service, you will still have 6% of them that are not pregnant at the end of the second service. And you will still have 1% of them not pregnant by the end of the third service. And they are completely healthy sheep. There is nothing wrong with them. They were just statistically unlucky. So we will routinely cull some ewes which there is nothing actually wrong with them. In saying that, there is a body of people that will just turn the top out for one cycle for 17 days and cull everything that is not pregnant at the end of that because they cannot be bothered with extended lambings and they feel that they can reduce their lamb mortality by just having one lambing cycle. And what they find is that a higher and higher percentage of their flock lamb within that 17 days. So they start off with maybe only 80% lambing within that 17 days, and by the time they go down the road for 10 years or so, they're getting 95% of their ewes lambing within that 17 days. So you increase the fertility by breeding for the ones that exhibit and hold to that first cycle. I'm not saying people should, I'm making you aware that you can manipulate most things in sheep. If you don't like it, breed for it and you will change it, if you've got the patience.